Good morning and welcome to our audience to this special session within the Infrastructure Africa virtual event, whose theme is Igniting and Unlocking Africa's Infrastructure Development Opportunities. Today we are hosted in collaboration with the Trade Office of the South African Consulate General in Milan and the Italian South African Chamber of Trade and Industries, of which I am the Secretary General, and my name is Pamina Bora. A special welcome to all our dignitaries from the Consulate, the Embassy of Italy, our dignitaries in South Africa and in Italy. Just a few words on the house rules before we begin. We encourage the audience today to submit questions via the chat box, as I'm sure you are familiar with by now. If there are any questions that come up after the session, please feel free to email us. We will also take provisions to share the slides that our speakers will be sharing with us as a downloadable content after the event for your use. And I think we are ready now to start with the actual discussion. Just by way of introduction, the infrastructure development, of course, plays a central role in South Africa's economic restructuring and recovery plan recently announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa. The government has recently established Infrastructure South Africa, which is a special agency that serves as a single point of entry for infrastructure, assisting in clearing any blockages to funding and implementation. Infrastructure South Africa gazetted an initial list of 50 infrastructure projects that are deemed to be ready for implementation, along with 18 strategic integrated projects in the first phase of this investment plan. Project submissions will cover 6 sectors, namely water and sanitation, energy, transport, digital infrastructure, agriculture and agro-processing, and human settlements. Today, South Africa spends 5.8% of its GDP on infrastructure, while the National Development Plan targets a spend of 10%. The country provides an excellent entry point for Italian companies looking at the African continent, where infrastructure investments have been increasing steadily over the last 15 years. South Africa has a very strong construction industry, which is of strategic importance as a driver of socioeconomic development. In 2019, the value added by the construction sector accounted for around 4% of GDP and employed well over 1.3 million people. This sector has a strong base of contractors and service providers that include JSE-listed companies and strong ecosystem of SMMEs. As such, a key success factor for Italian companies, of course, is to forge partnerships with local companies in order to learn about tender opportunities, to comply with requirements of local legislation, to win bids, and to minimize risk during the implementation and delivery of such projects. Today's webinar will provide an overview on how Italian and South African companies can cooperate and partner to successfully participate in infrastructure projects, both in South Africa and across the African continent. By way of welcome, I pass the word to Mr. Alberto Rini from the Embassy of Italy in Pretoria. Mr. Rini is the head of the Economic and Trade Office, and after many, many years of working together in South Africa, unfortunately, he's leaving us for Brussels for his next appointment, for which, of course, we wish him all the best. Mr. Rini, over to you.
Thank you, Pamina, and thank you for the good wishes. We'll see when I'll be able to leave South Africa, but it should happen soon. So anyway, first of all, good morning to everyone, and let me thank personally and on behalf of my ambassador, Mr. Paolo Cuculi, who unfortunately was not able to attend today, the South African Consulate General in Milan, the Italian South African Chamber, and the organizers of Infrastructure Africa for putting together this webinar on a sector which I believe will be crucial for the economic development of South Africa and more broadly of the African continent. And in this regard, I think the partnership with Italy will be greatly beneficial. As we all know, South Africa is a crucial logistic and manufacturing hub for the sub-Saharan region. It represents more than 20% of the region's GDP, and it has been long chosen by many multinationals as the base of operations for the whole continent. It has unparalleled infrastructures compared to the rest of the region: railways, networks, ports, airports, and roads. However, as any logistics company will confirm, there are huge margins for improvements, and which would greatly benefit the potential for economic growth of the country itself and the region. The African continent has been identified for years as the continent of the future for its demographic partners, its economic growth prospects, and South Africa being the most diversified economy on the continent. Pamina mentioned how important it is, the construction sector, for instance, will have certainly a crucial role in the future of the continental economy. There has been recently a lot of interest around the African Continental Free Trade Area, and a development which I think is truly exciting. However, to free the potential of the new free trade area, and it is needed a great push towards the development of continent-wide infrastructures. As data from UNCTAD will tell you, the lack of adequate infrastructure leads to excessive cost of transport. For instance, the final cost of certain goods is determined in Africa by around 1.4% of the final cost is determined by costs of transport, whereas the world average is 9% and OECD countries is 6.8%. So that has a huge impact. The South African government in recent years under President Ramaphosa has shown to be very aware of the role infrastructures can play in the future development of the continent and of the South African economy. To conclude, I think the core of the matter, what I want to say was sort of appeal to our companies, so Italian and South African companies, to reach out to us, to talk to us, to the embassy and to the rest of the Sistema Italia, of course, the Italian South African Chamber, of course, the Italian Trade Agency in Johannesburg. We are here to monitor the opportunities, to look for opportunities for joint ventures, for projects here in South Africa. We have a portal, the Extender portal, where we put the tenders that are out here in South Africa. So please reach out to us, and we will be, as an embassy and as Sistema Italia as a whole, more than happy to assist you in understanding more about this market, about the potential in this sector and other sectors, with the final aim of building back better our economies. That's it from my part. Thank you, Pamina.
Thank you, Mr. Rini. And of course, we also encourage the audience to continue to submit their questions via the chat box below. But let's carry on with the Acting Consul General of South Africa in Milan, Mr. Andrew Adams. Mr. Adams has been working for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation for 12 years with a focus on economic diplomacy. Mr. Adams.
Thank you very much. I think some of what I wanted to say has already been mentioned by yourself and also Mr. Rini. But I think from my side, I want to take just a few minutes to do a more high-level outline of what we're looking at in terms of infrastructure investment. So it's really a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this Infrastructure Africa conference. And it's one of the benefits that has actually come out of COVID is this digitalization, where we can participate from all over the world. So it's really fantastic to be able to participate. I think, as has been mentioned, one of the big things that has come out of Africa recently is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which provides significant opportunities for growth and development on the African continent. Africa has, for some time, as Mr. Rini mentioned, been considered as one of the potential rising stars in the world. It's said to be the biggest consumer market in the world very shortly, and there are inherently then significant opportunities. But we are now, as Africa, taking a conscious drive to move away from an external import driven economy to an export-driven economy, because currently the import-driven aspect of African economies just continues to serve to impoverish the continent. And this has happened now for centuries, and is something that Africa is going to move away from. In order to do this, South Africa, we often regard ourselves as the gateway to Africa. We have some of the most developed infrastructure on the continent, and we also have world-class infrastructure in many of our areas, world-class highways. We've got quite extensive railways and port infrastructure, but there is significant room for improvement. And we need to look at this and capitalize on this in order to truly capture the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and its benefits, and B, also for the upliftment of South Africa and South African people. COVID, as we know, has had a significant impact on all of our lives and all of our economies. South Africa has been very severely impacted, and the economy has been weakened significantly. But we do see signs of hope. We see the United States starting to really come out of it. The economic figures are looking quite good. Europe is also starting to come out of it, and China has seen some significant growth as well. So there's good news. There's scope for us to move forward, and South Africa hopes to capitalize on some of that, which is now why the President Ramaphosa, unveiled this economic reconstruction and recovery plan to really help South Africa to come out of this depression of COVID that we've had for the last year and a half. Focusing within that economic reconstruction recovery plan, we're looking a lot at infrastructure development. We're looking at especially infrastructure development that looks at the social aspect, social infrastructure. And it also looks to have a standardized design for the development of this infrastructure. So looking at improving ICT access and public transportation links. ICT access, especially important in terms of joining Industry 4.0. We're even talking about Industry 5.0 starting up now. And we need to look at ways that we can improve ICT access to South Africans and South African citizens, because even with this meeting now that's being done by the internet, without the internet now in a modern society, you just cannot grow and function. Also look at improving rail functions and railway operations. Freight rail is very important, but also looking at modernizing passenger rail services and improving safety and security on those railway services so that we can enable commuters to move around the economy quite freely. Ports and port infrastructure is another area that South Africa is looking at. We have invested heavily over recent years, especially under Operation Phakisa, the ocean's economy, but we still have a lot of scope. Our ports is really where we're going to unlock some of the barriers towards import and export, and our railway links between those. In addition, there's opportunities in improving rural road networks. Our rural communities are quite isolated. It's very difficult to get to them. And as we know, infrastructure leads to business and business investment. And we can unlock some of the investments that's potential in these rural areas if we really look at developing those road networks as well as railway networks towards them. And then finally, energy security is also very, very important. Anybody in South Africa at the moment can attest that energy security is quite a challenge. However, South Africa is already very developed in terms of its independent power producers, renewable energy sources, and there's also been quite a bit of investment from Italy into South Africa in that field, and we hope to see that grow and develop. What's also very important for us to note as part of this conference and session is that there needs to be a development of local supplier industries within the infrastructure sector. We need to localize. We need to have access to jobs within South Africa. We don't want to import our infrastructure. We want to develop it all locally. So that's a very important thing for us to remember. It was mentioned that Infrastructure South Africa has been creating a one-stop shop. Government is really trying to find ways of reducing the red tape in a broad base of infrastructure development and business investment opportunities. So we're going to that infrastructure, South Africa will really help to unlock that. And perhaps also just very important for those businesses and people looking to invest in South Africa, especially from Italy. We can say that South Africa has very strong and high investment attractiveness. We have a very strong legal system. Our financial sector is highly regarded internationally. And in fact, South Africa even rates higher than Italy in some of the ease of doing business indicators from the World Bank. So if one is to invest in South Africa, if you can invest in Italy, you might even find it easier to invest in South Africa and operate in South Africa. So this is one of the key things, is highlighting that there's not a lot of blockages now in this field. So I think with that high-level overview, I can finish. I wish this meeting well, this conference well, and I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. And I look forward to seeing the fruits of our labor in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Consul General, for providing this framework for today's discussion. I call upon our next speaker, Mr. Pasopa Moseshwe, to put his slides up on the screen. Mr. Moseshwe is a green economy specialist in the Investment and Infrastructure Office at the Presidency of the Republic of South Africa. He's a very experienced director with a history of building businesses in the green economy. So we look forward to your presentation, Mr. Moseshwe.
Thank you very much, Pamina, and to the Consul General and my fellow panelists. So a very comprehensive introduction has already been made in terms of what I'd be covering today. So as a starting point, the Infrastructure South Africa is a follow-on from the development of the Investment and Infrastructure Office in the Presidency. So that office was developed in November 2019, and as Andrew Adams has said, is a one-stop shop, a single point of entry into government for multiple infrastructure and investment approaches. From the investment side, we're responsible for helping to achieve government's ambition of raising an additional $100 billion US dollars in foreign direct investment into the country over this sixth term of administration. So that's a period over the next 3 years, as well as ensuring that that is primarily in the form of a foreign direct investment rather than capital flows or acquisitions of existing entities. In that respect, we support the 7 investment envoys, which were appointed by the President to assist in this effort. And they are prominent South Africans who, through many years, have developed networks that we are leveraging off of to support us in this investment drive.
Mr. Moseshwe, we can no longer see your slides. So if you would like to reshare, please go ahead. And I would like to just take the opportunity to also ask our audience to please submit their questions via the chat box or via the email addresses provided. Thank you.
Pamina, sorry, I was having a challenge scrolling through the slides, so I think I'll just do the discussion today without the assistance of the slides. I think it will also make for a more interactive session as I respond to some of the questions that pop up in the chat as I present.
Thanks, please go ahead.
So going back to it, no problem. So effectively, we also hold the mandate for something called the Infrastructure Fund, and that's effectively a $7 billion US fund to assist in blended finance to be able to crowd in the private sector into investments of mainly public sector infrastructure in terms of offering an appropriate risk return matrix. From the infrastructure side, we assist in managing a portfolio of strategic integrated projects. These are projects that are gazetted to hold the status through our legislation, something called the Infrastructure Development Act, and it allows for the fast tracking through Schedule 2 of this Act for permitting decisions. So to assist with zoning applications, with environmental impact assessment applications, water use licenses, etc. So fundamentally, we're leveraging off of the policy and regulatory element in order to create an environment which is conducive for the private sector to invest in infrastructure and generate a return for the benefit of the economy. As Andrea said, our preference is in terms of leveraging this to be able to drive our ambition of achieving GDP growth, creating employment for our citizens, and addressing some of the disparities that exist in the sense that we are currently a very unequal society. So we're using infrastructure as a flywheel to address some of these challenges while creating an opportunity and an environment for investors to generate a return. So the areas that have been targeted are the 4 network industries, and these are industries which offer a superior multiplier impact through the economy from investment into them. As Andrea's already touched on, these include transport infrastructure, both road, rail, and port infrastructure. These include ICT infrastructure. I think through the COVID environment and the forum through which we're having this engagement today, the importance of appropriate connectivity is key to linking people to investment opportunities, employment opportunities, etc. It also includes energy infrastructure. This is in line with an announcement that was made by our president last week, in fact, in terms of increasing the embedded generation limit from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts, and this should see an enormous proliferation of investments within the space to assist industry and heavy electricity users to decarbonize, as well as creating additional generation capacity on our transmission and distribution networks. This is also supported through the need for addressing infrastructure investment in another network industry being water infrastructure. And so we are anticipated to have a water shortfall of 17% by the end of the decade. And there's a need for massive infrastructure within the water infrastructure space, including bulk infrastructure, as well as reticulation infrastructure at a municipal type level. There's an opportunity here to develop programs that address some of the challenges around non-revenue water. So we have a water infrastructure in some cases which is aging and is leaking, especially in the reticulation infrastructure, and there's an opportunity to address this, create water savings, and have a revenue stream that's able to support investment. These are also supported by investments in 2 other sectors, being agri and agri-processing for its job absorptive ability. We have challenges of high unemployment and a mismatch between available opportunities and the skills of a number of unemployed people. So agriculture gives us an opportunity to be able to address some of these structural challenges and absorb unskilled labor, as well as human settlements. So we have a significant deficit in terms of what we call gap housing, people who earn above the thresholds for social infrastructure and potentially below the thresholds for bonded housing in multiple areas from an infrastructure perspective.
I call upon our next speaker, Mr. Giulio D'Almagro from Italian bank Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. Mr. D'Almagro, if you would please display your screens while I introduce you. Mr. D'Almagro is in charge of organization, structuring and execution of deals relating to private sector development in emerging markets. So we very much look forward to your presentation to see how Italian companies can be supported from a financing point of view to access these projects in partnership with South African companies.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me a few words on who is Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. We are the Italian promotional institution with a long history in supporting development of Italian economy. Our main shareholder, as you can see, is the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Italy. And the peculiarity of our business model is that a main part of our funding is based on postal funding, so postal saving of Italian people. As I mentioned, there is a long history. We've been active for 170 years. At first, for a long time, financing Italian local authorities and infrastructures, and Italian infrastructure, of course. In the last 10 years, we started our activity in international finance, at first supporting the export of Italian companies in partnership with the Italian Export Credit Agency, SACE. And in the last few years, we've been given the role as Italian Development Finance Institution. So we are CDP Development Finance is a new division. We have as a focus to support the growth of private sector in emerging countries through a number of financial tools. Debt, equity, funds, and blending with other institution money. So if you're a private company active in one of our target countries, and you will see later what countries I'm talking about, we can finance your investments. We can finance local partners in developing countries of your company. And we can finance the value chain of your business. So raw materials, manufacturing, logistics, all the value chain of your sector. Now, what are the countries where we can operate? All the blue countries in this map are countries which are eligible for financial activity. More specifically, the dark blue countries are priority for Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, but that doesn't mean that we cannot consider projects in pale blue countries if they have a significant impact in terms of sustainable development. Now, when we talk about sectors, you can see, I mean, we're talking about the usual suspects of the international cooperation. So we intervene in lending to financial institutions in order for them to lend to those small and medium-sized enterprises. We support energy projects, especially if we're talking about renewable energy projects, but if you talk also about transition energy projects, we can consider them. Agribusiness is quite important sector for us, and of course, infrastructure. Talking not only about transportation infrastructures, which are of course quite important for us, but also about social infrastructures. So we can get involved in all kind of infrastructure projects, normally with project finance approach, but we can talk about that later on. And then manufacturing, if there is a high impact in terms of job creations. Then we have a number of cross-cutting themes, climate change, of course, youth employment, and gender equality. Okay, how we actually work. I mentioned corporate loans, so this is probably the most plain vanilla activity for us. We finance companies in their investing abroad. We sometimes get involved in more structured transactions. This one I mentioned later with maybe securitization and collateralization. Anyway, generally speaking, corporate financing is probably the bread and butter activity for us. Then we have financial institutions. As I mentioned before, we do provide lending to both public, multilateral, or local development finance institution, and we can provide lending to private banks in order for them to support micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Sometimes for this kind of activity, we get some form of support on the direct lending of the financial institution to SMEs, thanks to some guarantees that we get through the European Commission. So we can provide not only the financing, but also a partial guarantee for the financial institution when they lend to the micro, small enterprises. Project finance, which is probably the most interesting bit here when since we're talking about infrastructures. So we can get into project finance projects. We quite significant appetite for even large tickets in project finance, long tenors. We've been involved lately in a big project in Mozambique, which is now on hold, unfortunately. But we can consider projects with significant size and tenors. And then funds, equity funds. We've been investing in funds which are focusing in countries and sectors that we consider as target and priority sectors for us. Right now, mostly in green and renewable energy. And we have two main constraints, which is probably important to mention here. The first constraint is we cannot finance all by ourselves, except when we're financing an Italian company. So if there is a project by an Italian company, we can finance it by ourselves. Otherwise, we have to find other co-financiers, and we can finance up to 50% of the corporate or the project we're talking about. And the second constraint we have, when we talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, we should find some form of intermediation. So we cannot finance by ourselves. We have to pass through either a financial institution or a fund, as I mentioned before. Being a development finance institution, we get access to donors which support us for specific projects. So we can get concessional money by Italian government, by the European Commission, by other donors. Just to give an example, we've been accredited for a Green Climate Fund in 2019. So we can, with donors' money, provide for some form of let me say, concessional financing, so we can provide for more competitive pricing, and we can have higher risk appetite, since especially considering European Commission provides for some form of de-risking tools that allow us to get into transaction where we probably will get in with smaller tickets, or sometimes we cannot get into without this form of protection. Then I mentioned two specific transactions. I think it could be quite interesting to mention. The first one is a financing in the agricultural sector in Ghana. We provided resources to the national cocoa company, COCOBOD. That has been a project with a very high impact in terms of job creation and productivity enhancement, in partnership with DBSA, so the South African institution, African Development Bank, and the Japanese JICA. Another transaction I like to mention is a financing for a project in South Africa, with an expansion of automotive production facility of this Italian company. CL is a leading Italian automotive component manufacturer, CLN. The project was approximately 130 million euro financing. We did co-finance together with IFC, the branch of the World Bank active in the private sector, and that allowed for job creation and automotive process innovation in South Africa. And that's it. Is a quick overview on what we can do.
Thank you very much, Mr. D'Almagro, for this very interesting presentation. Mr. Harrison, if you would like to share your slides on the screen, please proceed. Just by way of introduction, Mr. Harrison is a consultant at Thomson Wilk, a very prestigious Sandton-based South African law firm, and we've asked him today to shed some clarity on some aspects that for Italian companies can be really difficult to navigate, namely the BBEE policy, which stands for Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment, and the local content requirements, designated products, and all these concepts that can be really difficult to navigate. Without further ado, Mr. Harrison, thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for your participation and the interest shown in this presentation. As a preamble and in advance of speaking on those issues, Pamina, that you've just mentioned, I will also address some additional queries that I received helpful queries from Marcello Utara from the DTI in the Milan office. Just to emphasize what some of the earlier speakers have said, this is a sophisticated economy, and it's just one of the economies in Africa. So obviously, I will speak particularly to local requirements, but also just make some general comments about Africa. To give you an idea of the level of sophistication, some years back, I, for instance, advised companies on setting up a nuclear reactor in South Africa, which is not a common facility in Africa. And to give you an idea of how similar problems arise across Africa, as a member of the Italian House of Ambrosetti, I traveled with them to Zimbabwe last month, where we had a very interesting meeting with the president of Zimbabwe and 7 senior cabinet ministers that raised the same issues of needing to increase agro-business, agro-processing, their mining sector, and of course things like, and particularly the president stressed the ICT element. Alberto and others and Adam have also emphasized the fact that we're part of SADC and the free trade zone, which gives a lot of advantage. It's also probably be of interest to your Italian participants to know that we have a long and proud Italian heritage. And interestingly, there are many construction groups in South Africa which are sometimes second and third generation Italian companies. It has been emphasized that we have this infrastructure backlog. And as an example, there are going to be big projects on the water sector, again, to bring Africa back into South Africa, which will link countries like South Africa with Lesotho, because much of the water for Gauteng, which is the biggest economic hub in South Africa, is captured in the mountains of Lesotho in very sophisticated dams and then transported back to South Africa. So those are the types of large projects that will be going forward. And to emphasize what Mosotho said, we have a strong mining industry which generates big projects, a lot of export, a lot of foreign exchange income. And the announcement last week that these companies can spend up to invest in projects of 100 megawatts to generate their own electricity creates huge energy stability. And then we should also remember that there is scope in South Africa for public-private partnerships. Ford have recently announced major investments in South Africa, and that investment is to link their Pretoria manufacturing facilities with their Port Elizabeth engine manufacturing facilities. So they are putting many hundreds of millions of dollars into railway infrastructure uplift and in an uplift of port infrastructure in the Gqeberha area in South Africa. And then just as an interesting aside, I was fascinated to hear about our previous speaker mentioned the investment by CLN. I helped them make that original investment. It's an Italian company that now supplies the 7 major motor manufacturers in South Africa. I will turn now to the BEE and the local content, and we'll have to go through that fairly rapidly as they can be, and I will keep it to a high level view, because the rules and regulations guiding that are quite stringent and comprehensive. This slide, which talks about setting up in South Africa, is at the request of the DTI office in Milan, and I think it would be helpful for your participants to just understand that. So very simply, requirements to set up a company in South Africa. To establish a place of business is pretty simple. Our Companies Act says that if you do establish a place of business, you're required to either register an external company, which is known as a branch, or incorporate a subsidiary. And I'll come back to that. We should also let our participants know that South Africa still has a system of exchange controls. So where companies are set up in South Africa, they need to comply with exchange controls, which is, for people that are not familiar with exchange controls, it's a form of currency control. The good news is that for overseas investors, those requirements have been relaxed considerably. But to give you a practical example of what that means is, if a foreign company creates a subsidiary in South Africa and needs to fund it, then our South African Reserve Bank, which is the equivalent of other countries' central banks and which is abbreviated to SARB, South African Reserve Bank, they're required to approve any such loans in advance in terms of the duration of the loan, terms of repayment, interest rates, and currency. You can denominate loans in different currencies. The only practical effect is that the interest rates must be similar to the rates applicable to currencies, loans denominated in those countries, in other countries. A practical thing to bear in mind, if you do invest, if you do create a local subsidiary, is that when you acquire your shares in that company for exchange control purposes, have them endorsed non-resident, because that then permits you to remit your funds out of the country by way of dividends. I should perhaps specify the differences between opening up a branch and setting up a subsidiary. I think that, to repeat, a external company the branch is merely the local office of the external company. So it's one legal entity. People prefer to set up local subsidiaries because that puts a layer of in terms of liability between the holding company and the local company. That layer can, of course, be pierced by people asking for guarantees or local security. A point of interest is that branches and subsidiaries are taxed at the same rate of 28%, but a subsidiary is required to pay a withholding tax, which a branch isn't. However, a practical point for today's discussion on BEE is that one really needs to speak about setting up a subsidiary, as it is not practical to consider an external company or a branch for BEE purposes, and where joint ventures are considered. I've also been asked to speak about whether there are instruments available to protect an investment in South Africa. Bilateral treaties, as you all know, are the best way to do this. And however, the bilateral investment treaty between South Africa and Italy has been terminated. So the best way to protect local interests, of course, is in terms of the agreements and joint venture agreements entered into with either government, which is maybe the person requesting the tender, and or a local company. If probably a practical difference there would be if the government or a government agency is contracting, they will usually, in fact, most often require South African jurisdiction and the South African courts to adjudicate any disputes that might arise. What some parties prefer to do in setting up joint ventures is to consider alternative dispute resolution, often referred to as arbitration. That can be local, it can be international, and the parties can also choose the jurisdiction and the rules to be used in determining the dispute, and also what laws would be applicable. But I must stress, and I should just point out, I was appointed last year for a few months as an acting High Court judge. And all I can say is not because I have acted as a judge, but we do have a highly respected judicial system. Our courts are independent, and perhaps one only real advantage between using the courts and arbitration is that arbitrations are usually confidential. I will now just switch to my following slide. Simplistically, what is the difference between local content and BBBEE? And I'll perhaps abbreviate that to BEE. It's very simple, that local content relates to locally produced and sourced materials or products, where BEE relates more to black ownership and participation, and rather than to products. There is also the request for me to consider what an Italian company needs to do to meet local content requirements. Perhaps I should just speak more specifically to the local content regulations, and Masopa also referred to this earlier. Firstly, the products that have to be considered for local content must be designated in a government gazette and specified. And local content requirements can vary between 30% and 100%. To give you an idea, products containing steel are usually specified at the 100% level. You might ask me, what is the remedy of government if local content is not complied with? That can be quite severe. Firstly, people who do not comply and are found to be deficient can be restricted from contracting and or tendering for at least 10 years. The tenderer, if the tender hasn't been awarded, or the tender application can be disqualified. Much more problematic is that if this comes out during the contract can be terminated, and provision is also made for damages to be claimed. How is local content verified? Government does have verification mechanisms, and through the DTI and an entity known as the SABS, previously known as the South African Bureau of Standards, there are verification mechanisms. So probably how to maximize success in tendering in South Africa, I think that's probably self-explanatory. And if one thinks of it practically, the best way would be, well, first of all, the applicant should have the required expertise and a track record, and it is recommended that they partner up with a local entity with appropriate expertise and credentials. We should perhaps point out that there is a backlog in infrastructure, and there are local and very, very well qualified and companies with great expertise in implementing infrastructure in projects and going back many, many years. Probably the most important question would be, how can an Italian company best deal with BEE, and in particular the ownership component of the scorecard? We must point out that BEE is an essential element in South Africa. Ownership is particularly important, and it goes without saying that this is to upskill and empower local participants, and this BEE is rigorously applied. BEE can be dealt with in various ways. I will set out three possibilities, and firstly, to create a local subsidiary, which we can perhaps call a special purpose vehicle, and to empower that entity. That is not usually practical because it can be time consuming and require extensive due diligence for purposes of choosing a suitable partner and negotiating the transaction, especially where these tenders come out with tight timelines that may not be practical, not to be disqualified, not to be discounted. There is also something known as an equity equivalent program, where if you don't want to give up ownership because you're a multinational, you can go into what is known as an equity equivalent program. The main requirement is that you need to show as a policy, as a multinational, that you are not, that it is your policy not to give up ownership anywhere in the world. But more importantly, this can be a lengthy process, as it needs to be negotiated with government and signed off by the minister. It can also be costly in terms of annual payments based on valuations and turnover. And again, if tight timelines are imposed on tendering, probably not practical. And also, there haven't been a large number of equity equivalent programs implemented. Speaking from experience, and also speaking recently to some of the large construction groups, they recommend, and I recommend, and it's practical, for a foreign investor, in this case we're talking an Italian company, to partner up with a local company. This would usually require the local company to control at least 51% of the tender. That company would need to be very well and suitably BEE qualified. And what the local construction companies suggest is that the foreign partner incorporate a local subsidiary as a so-called, perhaps a special purpose vehicle, which gives it a level 4 contribution. And when you combine, if the majority local partner has the appropriate BEE points and qualifications, the ability to tender. BEE is much more complex than just pure ownership. It is also recommended that there's certain social responsibility spendings, skills upliftments, enterprise developments, but the local construction groups recommend a partnering where they are able to provide existing BEE ownership qualifications.
Mr. Harrison, we are almost at the end of our time. Unfortunately, can I please ask you to conclude?
I have 2 paragraphs. It goes without saying that any such new company will need to be funded by a guarantee from its holding company, and the exchange control issues mentioned above will apply in respect of any such loan. And we must just reiterate that BEE is a very strict requirement and needs to be strictly complied with. And thank you for allowing me to present.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harrison, for this very important presentation. I take the opportunity to mention that companies entering the South African market can also approach the Italian-South African Chamber to get advice on how to best tackle BEE, where to find local partners, how to do a due diligence on a local partner, where to set up or how to set up a local branch or subsidiary, and many more issues. Our last speaker is Mr. Antonio Monaco from a company called WeBuild that is perhaps familiar to many of you with its previous name, Salini Impregilo. It is an Italian industrial group. It's the largest Italian engineering and general contractor group and a global player in construction, present in over 50 countries around the world. Mr. Monaco, if you would please very briefly share one or two experiences that you have had in Southern Africa with your company. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. I will be very, very short. You have already shortly presented our group. The group is a special 115 years of experience all around the world in 50 countries of 5 continents with 70,000 direct and indirect employees for more than 100 nationalities. It is recognized for 5 years by Engineering Records, a USA World magazine, as the leader in the water structure, such as the dams, hydraulic tunnels, water treatment plant, management, and desalination plant. It ranks since 2018 among the top 10 in the company in the environment sector, and it is also leader in the sustainable mobility, especially metro rail lines, in addition to roads and bridges. Signatory of the United Nations Global Compact, the group's expertise is displayed in projects such as the M4 Metro Line Milan, the Grand Paris Express Metro Line Paris, the Cityringen Metro in Denmark, Copenhagen, Sydney Metro Northwest Red Line North Underground in Doha, Qatar. Line 3 of the Riyadh Metro and the high-speed railways in Italy. Other projects included the new, on the 23rd I will go, it would be better, less quick. Other projects included the new Genoa Bridge, the new Gerald Desmond Bridge in Long Beach, California, the expansion of the Panama Canal, the Snowy 2.0 hydroelectric power station in Australia, the Roguna hydroelectric dam in Tajikistan, Anacostia River northeast boundary tunnels in Washington, D.C., and the Al Bayt 2022 World Cup Stadium in Qatar. In the 2020, the group's total order backlog reached the 44 billion euro, with 90% of the backlog of construction order involving projects that support the sustainable development goals set by the United Nations. WeBuild is headquartered in Italy and is listed on the main stock exchange on Milan. It is to be outlined the strong impact that the social and economic development of the continent given by the Italian contractors. Among the Italian contractors, a prominent position has been and continues to be that of WeBuild Group, with its uninterrupted presence since 1948, with the construction of the port facilities of Alexandria in Egypt. Many iconic projects have been executed by the group in the continent. Among these, I wish to mention rescue of the Abu Simbel monuments in the period 1964-1968. Another iconic project was the Kariba Dam on the Zambezi River in the period 56-59. It was the first project financed by the World Bank in Africa. In Ethiopia, we have already built 4 hydropower plants, and 2 more are presently under construction. One on the river, named the Koisha hydroelectric power plant. The other is under construction on the Blue Nile, 700 kilometers northwest of Addis Ababa, and is known as the GERD, Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam. It's one of the biggest, it will be the biggest in Africa once completed. Nigeria presents another iconic project, is now under construction the Cultural Center and Millennium Tower in Abuja. In the mentioned periods, starting 1968, the group has executed several projects in the continent, in all engineering sectors, for a total value of about 23.5 billion euro at the historical contract value. More than 70%, it has 16.5 billion of the mentioned projects were executed in sub-Saharan Africa. The remaining 30%, about 7 billion euro in North Africa. Our group business is closely linked to the main megatrends that are taking place on a global level. It has population growth, urbanization, resource scarcity, and climate change. These trends are profoundly changing people's needs, influencing the priority of the public bodies and investors, and redesigning the competitive scenario of companies. In this context, we through our work, can do a lot, offering effective and lasting solutions to global challenges, concretely contributing to creating a better world for current and the future generation. Global infrastructure, directly and indirectly, influences 92% of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is fundamental to fight climate change, being linked to over 60% of the global CO2 emissions. Our experience in South Africa. Johannesburg Ingula Hydroelectric Project. The challenging project was completed in 2016 with Exxon Holding as client for a value in excess of euro 1.2 billion. The project, approximately 350 kilometers southeast of Johannesburg, on the border of KwaZulu, Natal, and Free State, involved the construction of power generation and pumping plant with a total installed capacity of 1,332 megawatts, which will produce electricity at peak times and then reuse the water, pumping it into the upstream reservoir times all of demand. It's a very important this one. I don't no need to give more details about this project. We are continuously monitoring the opportunities offered by the market and hope to be operating back in the country very soon. Presently, we are engaged in the construction of an important tunnel in Lesotho, the Islands Water Project Phase 2 Poliali projects, where the group have already built the first dam for the hydroelectric power plant in the area. We are, of course, cooperating in this project in Lesotho with companies coming from South Africa, including the BE company, as was mentioned, the gentleman that was speaking before. This was a very short presentation, very quick also, and I think it was clear and supported the knowledge of our group. Thank you very much, Pamina, and to the other ladies and gentlemen attending this meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Monaco, for this practical experience of a very prestigious portfolio of products and projects that one can really be proud of. This concludes our session today within the Infrastructure Africa virtual event on the topic of igniting and unlocking Africa's infrastructure development opportunities. I take the opportunity to specifically thank the organizer from Sienza Events, to thank the African Consulate General in Milan and the Embassy of Italy in Pretoria for their kind participation, and of course to all our distinguished speakers from the Presidency, from Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, and our legal expert, and of course Mr. Monaco from WeBuild. Thank you very much, and a good day to you all.